welcome to Varn Vlog. I'm here with Ralph Leonard, British-Nigerian writer on all things international politics and culture. And I believe you're a Marxist, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. It's hard to tell these days. Uh, um, one of the problems of Marxism's success that we might talk about is like everybody claims it, but it doesn't mean anything now. So it's just not unique to now, honestly, but it seems to happen every couple of generations. So I wanted to talk to you at first about an article you wrote for Sublation magazine about uh, Velasquez Grossman's accounts of Stalingrad. Um, and I find it interesting because there's kind of a tension around understanding the Soviet Union in this period. There are people who want to utterly condemn it because of the seeming daftness of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, how Marxist-Leninists will claim that Stalin was getting prepared, but the very attack on Stalingrad seems to indicate the opposite. Uh, but also, there's also this tendency that I think is actually larger and older, to not deal with what the Soviets did during the war after like 1950. I mean, uh, I don't know how Britain portrays this, but I know in American culture, there's this whole, well, we were on the side of Stalin during the war, but we're just not going to talk about that. And they didn't really help much. And we came and saved the day because the British were losing and the French gave up. And, and it's just like, yeah, but what about the Eastern Front, dude? Like, it seems kind of important since way more people died on that side of the war.
and the East was what the Nazis wanted. That was like the base of the empire that they
Right.
wanted to create, was what was the former Soviet Union.
I mean, it's interesting. I actually don't discuss very much, but literally, what the Nazis wanted to do was settle or colonize all of the East, and once they got done with the Jews, they were pretty clearly going to get rid of the Slavs. Like
Yeah.
that's
Like,
kind of explicit.
yeah, and like I think Hitler in I think it was the table talks referred to like Russians and Ukrainians as redskins. So he used that kind of discourse to talk about them as the sort of backward Slavic peasants who were going to, be the serfs of the Germanic Ubermensch after the war was over.
Hmm. So why do you think? Um, I mean, there's the obvious Cold War reasons, but why do you think that Stalingrad isn't really dealt with that much these days? I actually find it just really under discussed in general,
Uh,
even from people who are um, Solon, Soviet sympathetic or even Stalin sympathetic. Like, why do you think it's just kind of bracketed out? I mean, it does show up in American discourse somewhat, but it's always as well. Look at the stupid Soviets; they didn't see Hitler coming. Um, that's usually the only way it gets mentioned.
uh, I think it's interesting because the first interaction I had of the Battle of Stalingrad in pop culture was through the Call of Duty video games. Like
Mm.
I remember one of the first ones where I played when I was like 8, and you are like one of the soldiers, a Soviet soldier who's going to on the flotilla into Stalingrad, and there was just there was always something about that was very like interesting, at least for me. That was because it was sort of different to how you usually receive your education about the Second World War, certainly in the Anglosphere, because usually it's always like focused on the Western Europe, what happened in Western Europe, like D-Day or even North Africa for the British. But then with Stalingrad, I think one reason is that, at least a simple reason is like the censorship. We didn't really have all the sources because the Soviet Union sort of closed it off like until the 1990s. So so before then, a lot of what people thought about Stalingrad came from like these diaries from like German generals, which were obviously kind of very, very slanted, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And
For sure.
and I think it's very difficult. It's a very weird question because Stalingrad is one of the turning points of the war because it's one of the first humiliations that the Germans experienced, and I think so. And also some of it is a kind of there's always a sort of nationalist bring about the Second World War because each side believes that they won it on their own without the aid of the other party. So Americans believe that really America won the Second World War, and Britain thinks we held on during the Battle of Britain and that's what won it, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point, I think. Um, what's interesting, actually, for me is if you read American historiography about the Second World War, very early on they give a lot more credit to the Soviets, but even during the beginnings of the Cold War. But as things go, it's just like we just gotta erase that. Like we just can't talk about it anymore, because you know our hardest part of the war was actually not even in the European fronts at all. It was all in the Pacific, and um and that fighting is markedly uglier in a lot of ways. And so you definitely get the feeling like the Americans like to focus on the European side of the war because it when you portray it, it actually seems a little bit more heroic and less just utterly dogfight brutal. And B, um, yeah, I'm not usually one for easy racial narratives, but I do think it helps that everyone involved in that is nominally white, for the American understanding. That said, you know, the United States, excuse me, has a very, has a very strange position to find itself in because, on one hand, the part of the the Soviet Union that we want to condemn the most is also under the leadership of the people we were actually allied to at one point, and that throws everything off. Like, there's not an easy way to talk about it because from a lot, particularly the American right, Stalin is the great Satan. In fact, maybe we should have put up with Hitler more to fight Stalin. And yet, also, World War II is like our noble war, and it's the one we focus on because, frankly, it has a story that makes us look good, where like none of the others do. World War I, kinda, but our relationship to World War One is confused, and we literally could have gone on either side. I mean, we had contingency plans in World War One to invade Canada and kick the British out. Like, like we considered siding with the Germans, um, which I think is also something Americans don't want to deal with, and so we have in our popular consciousness, I think, kind of erased World War One, which makes it actually kind of hard to understand World War Two, except Nazis bad,
Yeah.
which is a perpetual part of American discourse, except the few people who go, "Oh no, Nazi America bad, Nazis must have been good." Um, but in general, uh, like that's the one war you can feel good about. Vietnam's too recent to write out, but I mean, like, how many Americans learn about the War of 1812? Like, it's mentioned in a school book like for 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Or the
uh,
Spanish, or the War of the Philippines.
the War of the Philippines, the Spanish American War, the Mexican American War.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we know about the Civil War, which is in some ways the consolidation of an actual national and bourgeois revolution. Um, and we know about World War II, and then we know about Vietnam because we unequivocally lost. Um, Korea, World War One, all the wars of the 19th century, which is like, we except for the Civil War, you just kind of whistle about it and hope no one notices. Um, I think that's interesting though, and the reason why I want to bring it up is because I also think the American left, and I actually want your opinion about the British left in this, has a hard time dealing with World War II. A, because it's one of the few times that the United States looks like unequivocally a good guy, and B, um, about our tendency to see Nazis everywhere. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's sort of like the only political. I'm always pushing back on it because I'm like, there are bad things other than fascist, right? Like, there are other forces of reaction in the world that aren't fascist that you can't understand through the lens of European fascism that are bad. Can we like? Can we
Yeah.
just like talk about that for a minute?
I think it's also because the Second World War is the founding mythology of what we call the liberal international order post 1945.
Mm-hmm.
That because it was built by the people who won the Second World War, and that's how, you know, certainly the United States sort of legitimates its sort of hegemonic position after the Second World War, that we beat the Nazis, and if we have to, we'll beat the next successor to Hitler. You
Yeah.
know. So
Who we're gonna normally portray as likely Russia, like.
yeah, yeah, or even before, Saddam Hussein, the
Mm-hmm.
Hitler on the Tigris, Nasser, in the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden called him the Hitler on the Nile, you know, as to justify the Suez intervention. So it's that metaphor has a very long history to justify all sorts of shoddy policies.
I mean, yeah. I mean, NATO exists. The American intelligence apparatus comes into being. I mean, this is another thing I think a lot of U.S. leftists can't deal with because U.S. leftists don't know what to do with the American state. Actually, because on one hand, so many of them are Keynesian and in their orientations that they worship FDR.
Mhm.
They have to see the American state as like something that could be possible for good. On the other hand, their racial narratives like have to necessarily portray the American state as a settler colonial nightmare state. Uh, and there is a place where both those things are true. Actually, I'm not even saying that they're entirely false narratives, but that's a fundamental contradiction on how you view the state as both like the ultimate enemy and also yet the only way to secure anything like social goods. And that and I think you see this in like the US left's incoherence around NATO. And which is really exacerbated by the current stuff in Ukraine, Russia, which is, we could both talk about how that has driven a lot of people just basically into fundamental incoherence and insanity. But there's also a way in which I don't think the U.S. left knows how to deal with like the state as such because on one hand they want to see it as a class neutral organ, and on another hand they have to see it as like the expansion of a white supremacist settler colonial state. Um, what they can't also see it as, and one thing I will say, this is a and not an or, is a classed state, like and one that is fundamentally so throughout. Like they might talk about the founders being that way, but then like once you get past the Civil War, it's like, well, you know, that orientation seems to be hard for them to deal with. Conversely, I think it's very hard for a lot of Americans to deal with an idea that I think drives them up the wall, that like a lot of the American left right now, and this is not historically true, this is like of the very last 10 years, uh, like will take absurdly pro-Stalin positions. Ones that like the Soviet Union or China have not historically taken. It's just like, and they seem to do it because they don't trust the U.S. narrative about the Cold War, which more good on them. You shouldn't actually.
Yeah.
But that leaves them with like no way to explain like Soviet internal dynamics or how weird things get in the 70s with official Marxism, how to deal with the Sino-Soviet split, how to deal with, I mean, fucking America now, we have Pol Pot apologists, like, who think they're arguing for communism and like ignoring that like the U.S. was supporting the Khmer Rouge to fight the fucking Vietnamese. So like, what are you doing there? And so I
I'll
find it
say
interesting. Mm-hmm.
I'll say that World War II is also difficult, a little bit difficult for the British left because,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously Winston Churchill is obviously portrayed as the hero of the war. He was, the prophet who predicted what the Nazis would do, and then he came in and saved the day just as Britain was on its last legs, and then won the war for us. But at the same time, it was Winston Churchill that did a deal with Stalin, literally on the back of an envelope, to divvy up Eastern Europe after the war. So Britain would still have its sphere of influence in Greece, Turkey, while Stalin would have most of Eastern Europe. And that's a bit difficult, even for a lot of the anti-communist conservatives in Britain, because, Britain went declared war for the sake of Poland. And then after the war, Poland's independence is sacrificed for the Soviet Union. So it's very awkward for both sides in this. And that was a consequence of the alliance, the necessary alliance with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis.
There's a whole lot of opportunisms that it's very hard to deal with. I mean, the other thing is, America likes to posit itself as the breaker of empires, while also being the empire of liberty, which is a very confused thing. The one thing I could say in the last 20 years is even right wingers will admit the U.S. has had imperial ambitions through most of the 20th century now, but it's taken a long time. If you hang out with a bunch of powerful centrist liberals, they're about the only people who do not believe the U.S. has had any imperial ambitions, except for like our stuff in the Philippines, and we're just not going to talk about that. And there's this bad time with Teddy Roosevelt, but we're just going to keep that quiet. Like, so I think that part of the discourse has changed fundamentally. And I do think there's a lot more people, even liberals in America, who are like, well, the Soviet Union really is like, we couldn't have won the war without them. But I like to point out, it's safe to say that now because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so we'd be like, well, the Soviets, they helped us, but they're gone now, so it doesn't matter. Like, but I think it's interesting. Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to say, just on that though there is a slight, in the way that the Russian Federation now, how it relates to the war, is, it basically Russifies the Soviet Union, that it think that Russia, Mother Russia won the war, despite the fact that all these nationalities that formed the Soviet Union like fought and defeated the Nazis, which as well sort of undermines a lot of the nationalist narratives that you even see with the Ukraine Russian war, and how people try and connect the two together, like you know Ukrainians were with the fascists, or that sort of thing, that sort of narrative.
Yeah, we're gonna understand. Actually, on both ends of the American discussion, we're gonna understand the Ukrainian conflict surely through the lens of Bandera, which is
Yeah,
somebody none of these people had heard of like until unless they were of Ukrainian or Russian descent until like or Polish descent maybe until like a few
yeah,
weeks ago.
yeah,
Well, a year ago now, but um, or we're going to portray, Putin as Hitler, neither of which are particularly helpful, like at all.
yeah,
Yes, there are fascist elements, and I would actually say there are fascist elements in all sides of this war, frankly.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but it's not particularly helpful to understand it in that context. And yeah, I also think it's interesting. I was taught, actually, even as a leftist, that World War II was the consolidation of the Russification of the Soviet Union, and that's like the more or less unofficial end of Lenin's nationality policy and whatnot. And there is some truth to that, but when I actually went through a book on Stalin's letters around when he's favoring like the non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union and the Great Russian people, he's literally going back and forth in his writings during World War II and after, like kind of seemingly for internal political reasons. Like that is where you start to get more talk about the Great Russian people and Russians being specifically think about the war, but that's also you also get pushback on that from the same man. I mean, Stalin's like literally going back and forth on this. Um, and so I realized that even the people who I thought were, fairly adept at understanding what was going on in the Soviet Union, and to be fair, it also may be a fact that, like, until the 1990s, we didn't really have access to the archives. We didn't have access to all the letters. But now it seems like that was a much more complicated process and not particularly thorough.
yeah. And even with the Battle of Stalingrad, that a lot of people sort of assume, like Anthony Beevor is a sort of conservative historian in Britain who's written a sort of a monumental book on Stalingrad, and the way he sort of talks about, how the Soviets fought, you sort of get the impression that they only fought because of fear of Stalin, as opposed to, foreign armies occupying my country and I have to defeat them. And what's it? There's always these slight urban legends, which is about how cowards were always shot on sight by the commissar, which there's a little bit of truth to it, but it's very exaggerated. Like within, like the film Enemy of the Gates.
Yes.
Would sort of portray that the Soviet Union, the Soviets would just hurl like bodies of men just towards their suicide. When if you actually study how the Soviet generals utilize their tactics, that's just not true at all. Because first of all, they just didn't have men to just waste at the time, because they were quite desperate at the time. So they wouldn't be so cavalier to just throw resources and men just so cheaply towards their deaths.
In short, they didn't always follow Order 277 to the exact letter, like because they would have ran out of people. Right? And also, I mean, the idea that the Soviets would not have resisted German Nazis, to me, is like, what are you on? Like, like I just can't even with my most uncharitable interpretations of Stalin's USSR, I don't believe that. like, it's just so yeah, I think that's a crucial point. This kind of brings me to, you mentioned Call of Duty and video games, that I think is interesting that we have finally seen, and actually interesting that's in video games and not movies. Um, if anything, movies about World War II have gotten more daft. Um, uh, so, uh, but there's, you mentioned Velasty Grossman. Grossman's interesting to me because he gets censored by Khrushchev so damn much, which is not, which also, you don't think of Khrushchev as the most censorious, period of Soviet leadership. So, how much do you know about Grossman as a figure?
Um, I've I've read there's actually Anthony Beaver also wrote a book about Vasilis Grossman as a journalist when he
Mm-hmm.
was with the Red Army, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about the interviews he would do with the soldiers, and you could see that some of that he translates into his fictional work.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's interesting because Stalin, the novel Stalingrad he wrote is part of it's a two-parter. Life and Fate is its successor, and Life and Fate is the more famous book he's most well known for. While Stalingrad, for most of its history, was either censored because he wrote it on while Stalin was still alive, so obviously it was censored then. And when it came out, it wasn't translated into English until very, very recently. While Life and Fate, which was part of the same narrative, um, was obviously sort of translated and spread throughout, the West and everywhere else. So yeah, and it's also interesting that Grossman is, he was born in Ukraine, was now Ukraine, and he was a Russified Jew
Mm-hmm.
who who joined the Communist Party as a way to emancipate himself from the anti-Semitism of the Tsars. So I've always wondered how he's sort of viewed in Ukraine and Russia, or the modern day Russia. So
Yeah, that would be interesting to know. I mean, it's one thing that I have actually, tried to wrap my mind around, actually, in the current situation, is every Russian speaking Jew I know from Eastern Ukraine uh, kind of balks at the focus on the Azov battalion and whatnot. And I'm always like, well, what do we make of that, really? I mean, a lot of people make a whole lot of heyday about Zelensky being Jewish, which is true enough. But it would be interesting to know, like, what someone like Grossman would feel about the post-Soviet period. I mean, unfortunately, he died of stomach cancer. So, also, I mean, if he was still alive now, he'd be like over 100 years old.
yeah,
But, but it's it would be interesting to know about that experience. I was going to ask you. One of the interesting things about this time period, Ralph, is for most of my life, the American left, the far left, uh, worshipped at the feet of the British left, particularly the Trotskyist left in Britain.
yeah.
We always were taught, always were getting stuff from the UK SWP and stuff like that. It was like theoretically we pulled from France and politically we pulled from England. Um, in the past 10 years, that's kind of stopped. I mean, like, and Corbynism seemed to, once Corbyn lost, we are like, well, fuck England. Like, we just don't care about them anymore. So uh, I find that I don't know as much as I used to know about the the state of the British left's response to current events. Um, how is the British left dealing with this Russia Ukraine stuff?
Uh, it's well. Let me sort of portray the different positions
Okay.
as fairly as possible. So you have the SWP, the old SWP,
Mm-hmm.
Tony Cliff's organization. Um, they sort of take a view that obviously they on the whole they say the West is more to blame. You know, NATO is more to blame for why it caused why the war happened for the usual reasons. And but they're but they take a very sort of idealistic line on it that well, if you know, if both sides would turn their guns on their bourgeoisie, then it will all be okay. And then you have like, you know, Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which is the Shachtmanites.
Do you have Shachtmanites?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, okay. It was like when I hear, like, usually it's like, as a side note, I'm like, British Trotskyist tendencies set up franchises in America. I'm not used to the reverse. Like, because the Shachtmanites and the Cliffites here were one thing. Like,
Mhm.
they became the ISO, which now is, you know, all spread out, usually somewhere in little subgroups of the DSA.
Mhm. So
But yes.
yeah, they take a more pro-Ukraine line,
Mm-hmm.
but from the left, so to speak. That you know this, you know that Russia is the imperialist, run by a far right authoritarian nationalist uh, oligarchy, and Ukraine and is the victim, and they should that while they don't sort of actually advocate that arms be put into it, they say, well, we're not really going to oppose it, sort of thing. That's
Mm-hmm.
and those are like sort of the broad positions within the far left in it. And though you know, obviously, you find that a lot of the centrist liberals would get on to Jeremy Corbyn's case because Corbyn takes a more like, well, let's go to the negotiation table line. And so every time he puts that line out, he always gets a lot of grief from like, you know, centrist liberals who are obviously very pro Ukraine and like enthusiastically. So, yeah.
Somehow that doesn't surprise me. Um, I saw the CPGB Provisional Committee, which is, you know, the
Yeah.
Neocaut faction, that they took a revolutionary defeatist line
Yeah.
that sounded neither Washington nor Moscow, but kind of Moscow, sorta.
Yeah.
Like, like, so I was
I,
like, I actually
while
couldn't quite figure out what they were saying.
while if you will, the Shatmanites take a defensist
Mm-hmm.
line that it's more pro Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
Kiev. Yeah. Yeah. But like not, if you will, it's like not quite, not pro Washington nor Moscow, but kind of pro Washington ish.
Yeah. So yeah, I've seen that. I think we have more weirdo esoteric groups in America who've taken in like an out and out pro uh Moscow line, like just straight up, including like trying to reconcile Alexander Dugin with Marxist Leninism and stuff like that. And I'm just like, I have no, but I will also say, before people, you know, come at me, I think those people are actually very rare. They're just loud on the internet. Like, there's a lot of weird tendencies in American politics that people say are just on the internet that I encounter in real life. That isn't actually one of them. So,
You also
the
have the
far,
you also have the LaRouche
yeah,
crowd.
we have the LaRouche people who have money, uh, but how much influence they have is hard to say. Um, so yeah, we have that, and then there's elements of the Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson, right? And I don't say that to equate Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson, but they are similar on this, who are also pro Russia. Some people, I come from a very conservative part of the country, um,
Mhm.
in central Georgia in the southeastern United States, and like I have people who like talk about suppression of the Orthodox and think they're talking about Jews, and so they're taking a pro Russia line. It's bizarre. Like it shows that a total ignorance of the history there. But then I think the vast majority, both right and left in America, are back to being pro NATO in a way that they have not been in a long time. That's which I think is honestly the more concerning tendency. But because I kind of get why Europeans, particularly ones in say Norway or whatever, are kind of more sanguine on NATO than they used to be. And if anything, I think like as a strategic mistake for Russia, like you put Europe back into the American camp pretty soundly.
Yeah, like
Um,
Finland, I
yeah,
think, was quite neutral, like on NATO, and then the second Russia invades, it goes straight, knee deep into NATO because it's right next to Russia, and they're scared.
right. And you know, I know I think Lester should take a principled stance against NATO, but I also think we have to realize like that position from places like Finland or Sweden, uh, that's an understandable position, whether we like it or not. like you know, like so. Um, I think that I think in the United States we have our own things to be worried about because increasingly it seems like our elite. I'm not sure they actually want war with China, but I'm sure they want everyone to think they want war with China. So, which may not make that big a difference ultimately, right? Like you just see all this talk about the Taiwan Straits, and I'm like, we've been kind of sitting on the status quo for this. I don't know for 50 years. I don't know why you're pushing it now. Um, I know it's a big part of Xi's rhetoric too, but it seems like there's a bipartisan consensus here to become aggressive to China. And I've actually said from the geopolitical stance that seems suicidal, but from the standpoint of a society that seems to only be able to justify itself in crisis since say the 1990s, a new Cold War would be politically beneficial to a whole lot of people as long as you don't actually deliver on it. The problem is, of course, is one, it destabilizes the world economy because the U.S.-China trade partnership has kind of been the driving engine of the world economy for a while. Uh, the EU does play a big role, but less and less so lately.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think that's very interesting. I bring this up and actually in lieu of an article you wrote in November, which I'll put in the show notes for our audience. I also put in the show notes of the one you wrote about Grossman, but in defense of internationalism,
Yeah.
um, because one thing I have noticed, the U.S. left has never been particularly internationalist. It's just I. I don't like overgeneralizations about Americans. I think they're somewhat cheap, but I will say this. We're a continent wide country and we sometimes forget that the rest of the world exists until we don't. Like it's
It's the stereotypical American provincialism.
mm-hmm. which of the negative European stereotypes about Americans, most of which I think are kind of bullshitty, that one's true. Like we like I would even go so far as we don't often even know that much about other parts of our own country. Like it's
Yeah,
uh like and to put that in scale for my European listeners, just remember the entirety of Britain is smaller than Alabama. Like just keep that in your head. Uh, so it's you have a lot more people, but like
yeah. I,
geographically we're gigantic. So
like it also applies to Europeans that a lot of Europeans sort of have a slightly caricatured view of the United States that
mm,
we always sort of we don't really kind of grasp just how enormous, how diverse, how sort of varied regionally it is,
mm-hmm.
how sort of the New England states in the Northeast are very different to the southeastern states, and how the Midwest is very different to the southeast.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know it shows when you come here. Um, um, I think a lot of people also. I mean, a lot of Europeans like don't grasp, for example, that the Southeast is like super racially diverse. For example, whereas like New England outside of New York, which of course is, I mean, it is a New York is a truly cosmopolitan city. But outside of New York, the Northeast is not. Like it's a very. I mean, frankly, it's mostly WASPs. It's mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant descended people who come from England, and that's not the case for most of the rest of the country. Actually, I mean, whiteness is kind of our thing because you had to like unify one part of the population because none of us were even the same ethnicity. I mean, like that is sort of what that was about. Um, I I think that's actually interesting. I so to get into you to actually brings up two articles you've written because there's another article you wrote where you pointed out uh, how American Pan Africanism from Stokely Carmichael on forward does it gets imported to Britain, but like we don't understand what you mean by black, and you don't understand what we mean by black,
Yeah.
and like which I have noticed before actually. Like I used to deal with a lot of Brits when I lived abroad. Although I've never actually been to the Isles, but and I'm just like, I think when you say black and when we say black, we mean different things pretty profoundly. Um, uh, but I guess maybe we can tie those two things together. Um, why do you think internationalism is having such a hard go of it right now?
I think one reason is the disease of campism, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've sort of briefly touched upon it, that how some parts of the left take a position that's effectively more or less just regurgitating, Russian nationalist propaganda points in regards to the Ukraine war, and because of as well, we don't also want to be, give ammunition to, say, the liberal interventionist internationalist line on it. So a lot of the left just kind of doesn't quite know how to grapple with like very difficult and complicated like national questions like Ukraine or Armenia, which I refer to in that article, or Iran, the the protests that they've had there, because a just talking about Iran, like obviously their regime is on, is an official enemy of America, yet, yet that regime is can't you can't in any sense describe it as some kind of anti-imperialist, like progressive regime. It's clearly a reactionary clerical theocracy, and I think with I think also it just reveals just how the power of the left, the idea of at least the idea of having a world revolution is just dissipated away because we don't know how to sort of grapple with these very, these national questions, as I said, these international questions, I should say.
I think that's actually fundamentally fair. In the U.S. left, it's not new. I remember people trying to figure out how to deal with in the anti-Iraq war protest, like being pro Hugo Chavez, but then Hugo Chavez is making forays to Iran, and we're like, well, we're against there is kind of an intelligent line in parts of the U.S. left where, like, okay, we have to admit that, like, the Islamic State is partly our fault for the bullshit we pulled with the shots, and that's all fair, but then it leads to everybody seeing everything like, say, the Green Revolution, or not having a stance on even like the reformist wing of the Islamic State in 2002, 2003. Um, that seems to just throw Americans for a loop. They don't know how to handle that, and I gathered that's probably true internationally. Like, nobody has a good.
Yeah, so this is the same case in Britain. Like we saw even during the Arab Spring, you had um, this kind of strange double thing. So when it was obviously the Egypt, Bahrain revolutions or Tunisia, it was kind of very easy to take a stance on it because a popular uprising against a regimes that have been supported by Britain, America for a very long time, partially for counter-revolutionary reasons or to stave off like Arab nationalist regimes, uh, movements. But when it came to, say, the Libya and Syria revolutions, it was a little bit more difficult because all, at least in both cases, they got sucked into sort of more intricate geopolitical machinations, and obviously the violence in both those cases were far more intense than you got elsewhere in the Arab world. And I think a lot of the left just doesn't know how to grapple with that when you have multiple social forces in competition with each other, which is in a sense what a revolution is,
Right.
in part.
Well, yeah, I think,
yeah,
yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think even more so, I mean, even think about the U.S. inability to deal with something like the Yellow Jackets in France, because it's the nature of that movement as an anti-systemic, vaguely class-aligned movement does not map onto the U.S. left or right really well. And there's been increasingly in the United States a left liberal fear of populism because it's tend to cut right wing so much, but they also like to blame it for they also like to blame left populism for whenever they lose anything. So it becomes hard for them to even figure out, like, should we have solidarity or not. And there is also reality in the revolutionary moment. I think people really need to get this through their thick skulls. Like, of course everyone's intelligence agencies are going to be all over a revolution. That, by the way, was also true in the Bolshevik Revolution. I need to remind you how Lenin got back into Russia. Like, the Kaiser's the Kaiser's intelligence organization snuck him on a train. Like, so it's it's something that we should expect, and I think that throws people off because it's like, well, there are bad people on and yes, of course there fucking are.
yeah,
Like, like it's like there's no revolution that's going to be clean like that.
yeah.
Like, even a
And it,
worldwide revolution, I mean, like, Marxists used to at least be able to talk about the contradictions of the working class in a complicated way. nationalism versus internationalism, chauvinism versus internationalism, and all this. And I don't just think this is a modern problem. I think since like 1920, we've been broken on how to deal with that. This is
Yeah,
like for literally a century.
and and it's a little bit more difficult because at least nowadays the revolutions that we see are not leftist or socialist, you know. So, and in many ways they're very post-political. These uprisings that we see, like there isn't like a vision of society that's been put forward, and we shouldn't expect it to be um, because because like socialism has sort of withered away for such a long time. It doesn't surprise me that you know you see like color revolutions that you see a lot of noise about that at least like at least ostensibly sort of liberal democratic somewhat
Mm-hmm.
at its best, and in other cases it's more there's a little bit more reactionary strains that are very loud as you see in some parts of the Arab Spring. But again, it's like what else do you expect? Like don't like like don't be surprised because if you expect a revolution to be axiomatically to be like the most perfect communist, you know, revolution ever, well, you're going to be waiting forever for that. It's like we have to find a way to sort of engage with the contradictions and the paradoxes of the popular revolts that we see. And it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily support them or be uncritical about it, but we have to engage with it. Doesn't mean we can't engage with it.
I would even say that's true for a lot of the like hashtag revolts we've seen in the last 10 years, Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
etc. All those have had a very mixed character. Um, Often the character even changes dramatically over a very short period of time. And I don't know how people in Britain understand this, but I'm like, usually they start off as like street revolts of all kinds of working class people, mostly black, but you know, multiracial really, that erupt in the industrial cities of the Midwest. And there's a reason why it's there. That's the place that's been economically just forgotten, but there's a lot of people there, right? But then they move throughout the country and they tend to end in like New York, Portland,
Yeah.
etc. Which is interesting because that is a different pattern than say the Occupy, which starts in the kind of coastal hubs and actually spreads everywhere throughout the country and is picked up kind of universally for a little while. And I think all those movements had a mixed character, including, and I think in a way that is hard for people to put their minds around, even internal to the United States. Um, I mean, I remember listening to people from the UK who were like, "Well, this is a revolutionary event, the way Lenin talked about, and and everything's going to fall apart." And I remember just being like, "There might be some reforms that come out of this. This is obviously important, but it's not that."
Oh,
And and I'm like, it might feel that way because you're consuming it through a very panicked media, um, you know, but it's there's not actually a coalesced constituency here, nor is there really a positive vision beyond the immediate demand of
stop killing me.
stop killing me, right?
Yeah.
Like, and honestly, um, these things happen in the United States. Have happened periodically since the 1960s. Like we've gone through probably about every 15 years we have riots around these issues. What's interesting about now is police brutality is actually probably more generally widespread, but there's also a sense in which like the answer that was immediately came up with, which was defund the police, which even if you're a police abolitionist, has never struck me as like, that's a dumb idea. You're gonna take away the money from the people with the guns. I don't know how you think that's gonna go. Like they still have the guns. Like but even beyond that, like there's a sense in which like it was recouped along lines that someone like Adolf Reed Jr. would predict. Like we saw very little change of the wealth situation for Black people post COVID. In fact, I would say if anything, it looks to be getting worse. Yeah. We have seen an increasing number of like nameless elites on the Barack Obama model. Lori Lightfoot is an example of that in Chicago. And I think Lori Lightfoot's considered a rebuke to progressivism. It may be, but what Lori Lightfoot really is like Obama, like Kamala Harris. You find a prosecutor or someone attached to the our lawyer who has very little background but has the right identification and has the right training, and then you use the fact that they're basically ciphers, but they're ciphers of the right identity to project both conservative and progressive values on them. And then when they can't deliver, well, with Barack Obama, it worked, but after that, none of these people have been popular. But like the Democratic Party seems to like have taken this as a prime strategy. And what's interesting is I'm not a progressive. I don't like people to associate me with progressivism, but I find it hilarious that I'm like that people are like, oh, it's a rebuke to progressives. I'm like, these people were ciphers. They tried to be everything to everybody, and they're nothing to no one. Like,
they want to be defund to the police to progressives, while at the same time tough on crime to conservatives.
Right, exactly. They're gonna use the rhetoric of both camps, and that'll never work. Like, how does that like? And what's really happened is, ironically, during this time period, there's probably less police accountability than ever. And I don't just mean that in like who they're killing. I also mean that like murder rates in the United States just have spiked a little bit, but the solving of those rates, like we used,
it's like half or something.
Yeah, it's like half. We used to have like a 75% murder clearance rate in like the 1980s, and now we have like less than half. In some places, it's even lower. Sometimes like 30%, and so it's like, well, now we kind of have the worst of both worlds. The cops are still here, but and yes, I get it. The cops have always been an occupation force. I understand that, but they did used to do something like that. Now they, other than just protect property and all that. And I know Marxists and radical liberals like to talk about that, and they're not entirely wrong. But then they just ignore the fact, but things have gotten worse on some key levels, and you don't have any answer for it at all. Another example of that would be like, well, we need to throw more social workers at it. And I'm like, we don't have enough social workers now.
Yeah.
We don't have enough teachers now. We don't have there's no sector of our civil service that could just go in overnight and fill that gap. It doesn't exist. Do you want to do it? Like as a socialist, I actually think it's all our responsibility to deal with social problems like this, but I don't see you volunteering, do I? So, and I say that and people hear it and they're like, oh, you're a conservative, you're siding with the cops. I'm like, no, I mean, like, I don't think any of this is good, and a lot of the crime in America is like, it shouldn't even be illegal. Like, we should be quite frank about that. But even to put it this way, even though we have something like triple the murder rate of Britain, well, no, actually, I don't think that's true anymore. That used to be true. That's not true anymore. You guys have actually kind of caught up to us, to be fair. But we have triple the murder rate of say Northwestern Europe. Our incarceration rate, however, that's still like somewhere, and the U.S. average is something like 7 per 100,000 murders. Our incarceration rate is 500 per 100,000. Like it's obscenely higher than that. So that's not what's driving incarceration, obviously.
Yeah,
So like,
I think I read a stat that the United States has incarcerated more people, except for Stalin at the height of the gulags. I think that's the only one that really beats modern American incarceration rates.
there's actually a debate that we might actually have surpassed Stalin at the height of the gulags. It's a debated point. Like it's just like it's like yeah, I mean that's not a criminal justice system that you can say is effective unless it is just aimed at removing large parts of the surplus population, which
And
maybe it is.
yeah, and also it reflects that a lot of how criminal, because you always have this debate in criminology, what's the purpose of prisons and police? Is it to prevent crime, or is it to punish it? No, or no, is it to reform, like people commit crime, or to prevent it? And the sort of the consensus has been to what incapacitation. That was James Q. Wilson's sort of defense of mass incarceration. Well, nothing really works, so we might as well just incapacitate the people who do bad things, because if they're in prison, they can't do anything. That's the logic behind it. And
yeah, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to work. So either.
And this is the contradiction with the debate around the police crime is even a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith and Cesar Beccaria sort of got this point that the actual sources of crime and disorder derive from political economy, and the police at best is like a first stage emergency like service that they don't really prevent crime in the way we think they do. They help manage it,
Right.
and that's unfortunately the way the crime debate is framed. That's a very hard point to get across, because a lot of people sort of judge crime compared to yesterday, and they want quick solutions, like we want the virus to stop now, and that sort of thing.
I mean, I think that's I think it's a hard problem. I mean, honestly, because one thing I will say is like, even if we were to get the the programs we needed, and say we had like full communism or whatever, I think about the experience of like the Chinese Communist Party. It took them a generation and a half to get a lot of that under control. And like the myths of brainwashing actually are about their attempts to like, well, we have all this lumpen proletariat. We don't want to just shoot them. We don't want to have a massive prison system, so what do? We need this re-education, camps there for what non-hostile classes, which basically was code for some of the petite bourgeoisie, some of the rich peasants, and mostly what we would call the lumpen, but like the criminal gangs that developed during the Warring States periods. And it took them a long time to get a handle on that. About a generation. And I think in a society like the US, it might even take longer, because there's so much social distrust that has been bred into our society. I mean, we are in some ways a society that fundamentally does not trust itself at all, which I don't know. I feel like, I like to give Europeans a hard time. It's a habit I have. I think, Americans have let Europeans get away with their anti-Americanism for far too long. But in another way, I think that um, social trust in Europe is slightly higher. I think it's decreased greatly too, actually, but it's still slightly higher than it's probably ever been in the United States. We're just a society, and for good reason, we don't trust each other. I mean, like, think about our history.
Yeah.
Um, but like, it's not just the paranoid style. It's like, no, it'd be like our frontier history means that everyone kind of does have a right to be paranoid. Like, um, but it's not. I think my frustration is like, I think a lot of leftists too want a quick fix to the problem. For example, you do have to deal with maybe what we might call the lumpen bourgeoisie or the criminal bourgeoisie and this whole black market around drugs and mostly drugs, but guns, etc. Um, and and you can't just deal with it solely as oh, they're victims, because I'm like, well, no, these are black market criminal empires. Like, if you don't deal with them, they can become oligarchs. I mean, like, look at what happened when they didn't deal with them in the Soviet Union, and then they just unleashed forces at the behest of the United States.
Yeah.
It was those people who became the bourgeoisie. Not a great idea. Like,
Or they grow into cartels.
right, exactly. Which, I lived in Mexico for years. Cartels are a real thing. I mean, there is a way. I read a book called "Cartels Don't Exist," which is one of these provocative titles that actually has. It's one of those Mott and Bailey things where, like, actually the point in the book is reasonable, but it's trying to get you by saying something ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um, and that is like that the entire Mexican security state is like built around these cartels. And I'm like, yeah, it actually is. Like, like, it's very true. Um, and focusing only on the cartels misses like the social context, in this case the international social context. The US plays a big role in this, for the existence of those cartels. And again, true, absolutely true. But the cartels are real, and I think, just giving those people socialized medicine wouldn't necessarily get rid of it. Like,
Yeah.
so
I remember
go ahead.
Marx Weber once wrote in an essay, "Politics as Vocation," where he said that if you get involved in politics, you are going to be engaging with diabolic forces. In other words, if you want to be involved in politics, you are going to get your hands dirty in some way or another. By necessity, you will. And I don't think the left wants to get its hands dirty.
I absolutely agree with that. Like, which is why I think that's partly why they like losers so much. That seems like a flippant observation, but like, you know, to get to get famous, and like, if you want a career on like the American left circuit, be like, I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn, and a British politician who lost.
Mhm.
You know, I'm like, yes, there are reasons why Corbyn's lost. Yes, Zionists went after him. Yes, the neoliberal parts of the party went after him. Absolutely true. That's going to happen to you. Like, when we win, they still do that. That doesn't mean they're not losers. like, in fact, we should be very aware that that will be the first thing that happens. Like, and I find that kind of, I think about Hugo Chavez a lot, and I have a lot of critiques of Chavezismo, but I will say the one thing he got, and the reason why the reason why Maduro is still around, is they understood that you couldn't just, I don't know, not deal with the military. Like, at all. Like, oh, we're not going to get soldiers in our ranks and stuff like that. And you talk to Americans about that, and they're like, what do you mean we have to? I'm like, the Bolsheviks knew that they at least needed rank and file, and it helped if they got some officers. Like, they understood that.
Yeah.
You don't. Like, have those people done ugly things? Yes. Which is part of why you need them.
Mhm.
Some of them would like to stop having to do such ugly things all the time. I promise you. Um, but yeah, it's. I think that's an absolute truth. Um, I mentioned, and this will be the last part of the conversation, and this is a little bit tangential, but it is related to internationalism. I have a story I like to bring up about the local DSA chapter here, which decided to decolonize its name by just removing America from its title, so it became the Democratic Socialists of Salt Lake City. Also a settler colonial thing, but not whatever, and not the Salt Lake City Democratic Socialist of America. And they did this off of decolonization. Now I want to point out that Salt Lake City is 60% white. Its minority groups tend to be Latino and Polynesian, and then some not African Americans, but African immigrants actually from like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, to some degree Nigeria, etc. Haiti. So I guess different kinds of African Americans there, but uh, the DSA's like that was the response, which I found funny because it was very similar to like the city government's response when it tried to do diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. It went out and hired people from the South. And I was like, okay, if you're hiring this so that people here are more represented by groups that are from their own community, why aren't you hiring some highly educated local Latin person? Like, why are you going to like hire African Americans from Mississippi? Like, if the reason is not some weird tokenism, why aren't you like, you want someone who understands the communities here, then you should hire people from those communities. Why like it's not just like anybody. It doesn't even make sense from the it doesn't even make sense from the DEI framework the way people implement it, because it's like, well, all non-white people are the same. What? Like, um so, and it seemed it just seems so incredibly superficial. um if I was one of these diversity, equity, and inclusion people, I would be highly pissed off about how my work was being used. I'm not. So I'm a Marxist, and I'm not. I'm not here to make a moral judgment on that one way or the other. But it does seem to me like decolonization doesn't mean what it used to mean. Like, if all you have to do to decolonize something in say a place like Salt Lake City, or to even gesture towards it, is change, just remove America from a title. That is the most superficial stuff I can deal with, uh, and it seems very symbolic and romantic. You've kind of written a lot about like the end of blackness as a political question, and the limits of decolonization, and um, so what do you think are the limits of decolonization?
Well, I think what we've seen is how what we understand as decolonization has changed.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you were in the 1950s, decolonization had a political meaning, which was the
Kick the British
emancipation,
and French out.
yeah, and create your new nation without,
Mm-hmm.
so that you could rule it by yourself. But then, very
Kind of
recently,
synonymous with national liberation,
yeah,
basically.
yeah, and then recently, like, decolonization has taken on a very sort of cultural meaning, which is more or less sort of try to, at least as far as people of color are concerned, sort of de-link from the West, like get rid of any sort of Western influence from, whether it's in Africa or even within, say, the United States or Britain, like sort of decolonize the curriculum, well,
Mm-hmm.
which basically means, I don't know, people should read more Toni Morrison. That's more or less what it basically means. or
Right.
and and it just, on the one hand, it's so superficial that it doesn't really mean anything. Like it's just it's a kind of symbolic radicalism, or like a symbolic anti, iconoclasm. Like, oh, we, you saw this as well with the whole debate of the statues during the after the George Floyd protests, and it was actually ironic because the one of the memorials that got attacked was the Shaw Regiment Memorial, or which was the obviously the unit of black soldiers that was created to fight in the Civil War. I
Right.
always
Yeah.
found, yeah, I always found that quite funny and ironic.
They also attacked a bunch of murals by communists in public schools in California because they portrayed that, as part of the. So I mean, I was, you know, I, on one hand, like I don't really give a shit about statues. On another, I'm like, okay. I mean, because I see those symbolic forms of protest as kind of ephemeral. I'm like, most of these statues were built in the 1920s. But on the other hand, I'm like, it also shows this incoherence as about the past because people don't even often understand, like, they don't
Yeah,
know enough about what they're even attacking.
yeah,
Like,
and it seems to me quite reactionary in the sense that it's more about trying to rewrite the wrongs of the past as opposed to trying to create a better future.
right,
It's like it's it you know it's it's funny because Fanon had a great sort of line in the conclusion to Black Skins White Masks when he said like I will not have my head stuck in the tower of the past. I have my eyes towards the future only. So, and it's which I always find good coming from him since he's always attached to that kind of decolonial uh, rhetoric, which I think is stupid. But uh,
yeah. Well, the uses and abuses of Fanon is sort of uh, I could do a whole show on it, about like how many people who invoke Fanon have actually read him. Um,
and at its worst, a lot of this decolonial rhetoric is just like a rebranding of like Herderian, Volkish romanticism, especially with language, because
mhm.
like you see a lot of this stuff in African countries about, oh, should we stop using these European languages because it's it's a symbol of our spiritual colonization that we have to speak in either English or French or Portuguese or Spanish. And for me, I take the opposite view. I think that the assimilation of these languages into the social fabric of these countries is actually is the actual decolonization, because you say in Nigeria the English Nigerians speak is not the same English that Americans speak or English people speak or Irish people speak. It's its own thing, or the English Indians speak. Yeah,
Right. I mean, I always talk about how I talk about more people speak English who aren't from native English speaking countries and who it isn't their first language than people who speak it as their first language.
yeah,
Like, and they are very different. I mean, I remember after I lived in even someplace like South Korea, where English is not an official language, but everyone kind of speaks it, and it's kind of woven into, South Korean. It, there is a thing called, we used to call it Konglish, and I was like, you should be proud of Konglish. Like, you've taken an international language and you made it your own, and yet we can still mostly understand you.
yeah,
Like it, but it's yours. Like there are things about, like, you could, you know it's as different as, say, when people talk about African American vernacular English or something like that. Um, and I don't know. I tend to. I don't think one culture owns a damn language, and nor do I believe in like sapphire wharfism, as if there's something mystically encoded in a language that totally like limits what you can think or say. Like, um, for example, the fact that Schadenfreude is not in English doesn't mean that I don't understand exactly what it is once you tell me what it is. Like, it's like I already have it. That experience, it already exists. We just don't have a word for it, but like
Mhm.
whatever, I think that's interesting. I also, I mentioned to you off air, but I also always go back to Chinua Achebe's famous essay on the African writer in the English language, because he also points out that, like, look, if we are really consistent about this, you're going to have to throw away the very things that you can use to fight the Europeans, such as like the idea of a nation together, because that's not an indigenous concept. Like,
Yeah.
like, and I'm like, I mean, so I was like, well, if you fully decolonize, you don't fit into um, the modern world. Now, maybe as communists, we could take a more radical vision of that, but it would have to be much deeper than just like, well, maybe we should go back to speaking Swahili or something. But as if some of these languages themselves were not colonial languages, or not colonial, imperial languages of a pre-modern era. But that's a whole different thing. Um, I find that it seems interesting that decolonization after the national liberation movements just feels like a muddled idea. Like okay, now that you have
Yeah.
thrown off the explicit yoke in most places. I mean, yes, I mean, there's a lot of places in Africa that should still tell the French to go fuck themselves. But um, beyond that, uh, what is this exactly? Because you're not, I'm not a linear progressive thinker on history. I don't think the world moves in a Whiggish fashion. I think that's nonsense. But I do think like this idea that you can like reverse time's arrow and that will be a good thing. It's just, I think it's actually inherently reactionary. Like I just do,
Yeah.
because it's not possible for one thing.
And it could go into a very dangerous rhetoric about national purification, because a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the post-colonial states, like a lot of other nation states before in Europe, engage in their own sort of um, consolidation, like oppressing minorities, banning this language or that language, whether it's in Turkey with the Kurds, in some Arab countries with the Kurds, in some of the North African countries with the Amazighs and Berbers,
Mm-hmm.
their cultures, in uh, you know, in unfortunately in Nigeria we've had our own. In Nigeria, it's a little bit unique because we don't really have a majority ethnic group or even a religious group. So it's
No, yeah, yeah. I mean, what I used to teach junior achievement to high school students, and I'm like, okay, now I have to explain the tribal and religious divisions amongst Nigerians. This is going to take me an hour. And nobody is going to remember it. So
yeah,
it's like, so let's talk about the Igbo, who are like indigenous and Christian, and the Hausa, who are Muslims, and there's different kinds of Muslims in Nigeria.
yeah,
The British just drew a bunch of squiggly lines on a map. Okay, I'm sorry.
yeah,
Like, like
and
um,
then and recruited some ethnic groups into their police, which laid the foundations for what would happen afterwards. You know, and recruits other, the Igbos into the civil service, the Hausas into their police like unit, which helped contribute to what happened afterwards, unfortunately. And
Yeah, I mean, it's perfect sense. I mean, I hate to like point out that like to people that I'm like this is also true for European national consolidation too. Like, um, the English use and abuse of the Scottish is kind of historically an instantiation of this, and unfortunately, this is in the deep history of nation building project. I can't think of a nation that doesn't do this. You know,
E- ev- yeah, every nation's done some version of it. Is it's like the old saying when Italy was founded. Now we have Italy. Now we must create Italians.
yeah. I mean, I guess this leads us in a place of trying to figure out what should a left do with all of this because um, there's a whole lot of like I call it addiction to the 20th century, but there's also a move to trying to pretend in America to try to pretend like the 20th century didn't happen. Just in general, like I always think like for example a lot of the Stalin fetishization on the U.S. left now, and it is actually kind of new. Is like, well, wouldn't it be great if like most of the 20th century just didn't happen at all, and we could just go back to like triumphalist USSR in like 1927? Like it's just like, and I'm like, yeah, history doesn't work that way. Like, um,
Well, I would say that at least from the starting point, like the left should accept that the 20th century did happen, and there's no getting away from it. But we shouldn't allow the 20th century to become a fetter on a revolutionary critique of capitalism or a an attempt to, if you will, transcend capitalism. So I don't think those two things shouldn't be confused with one another.
that's a good point. Um, so I'm gonna link at least three articles we mentioned today. Your piece on Stalingrad from Sublation, your piece on the demise of political blackness, although we didn't talk so much about Stokely Carmichael or Black Power or Pan Africanism. Um, but I think it will give some context for what we're talking about here in your in defense of internationalism. I think for me the greatest theme from your writing is uh, there's a lot of contradictions in society right now, and so that manifests in the left. And the left seems to most of the left. I mean, it's always dangerous to overgeneralize, but I think as a trend seems to be basically digging its head in the ground and wishing those contradictions would just go away. Like we don't have an easy answer for them because no answer for them would be easy.
Yeah.
And so if you just kind of pretend they don't exist, then which I think is I mean I think it's obviously a dangerous tactic, but I think it's been really damaging to the anglophone left. I'm hesitant to generalize to the world, but I do feel more comfortable generalizing about the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, and Scotland and Ireland. Even though also I realize those are very different places. Like, um,
You forgot the northern part of Ireland.
oh yes, yes, Northern Ireland, good old Ulster,
Yeah.
and uh, oh, that's a mess. Actually, I mean, two things I think have thrown Americans for a loop is they don't know how to deal with Scottish independence or with Irish unification anymore. It's just like is Scottish like are we wait is Scottish nationalism good because it's pro EU or is it bad because it's a micro nationalism or does it part of me is like well whatever fucks with the English government, I'm usually okay with. But I realized that all these countries, like it's. I remember pointing this out about the situation in Spain and with Catalan, and I'm like, on one hand, what the Spanish government's done to Catalan is not defensible. On the other hand, and maybe in the context of the EU, it doesn't matter so much. On the other hand, I don't have a good answer for what we declare as the legitimate size of a nationality or not. Like, because theoretically, should we also be supporting like regional movements to break away from the U.S.? Like, they exist. Um, some of them have somewhat solid grounds, even. Um, but nobody would, aside from occasionally California liberals who believe that California should be its own country, would do that, because I think they even realize like the moment they would do that, it would their own economy would immediately be destroyed just by leaving, because they'd leave the U.S. currency zone.
Yeah.
So I think in nationalism and internationalism in general, the left right now just is in a very weird place where it can't figure out how to
Like
decide on any of these questions.
even on the Irish question, like a lot of people in Britain don't quite know how to deal with it, because Brexit all of a sudden has made the Irish unification an actual possibility now, because Northern Ireland actually voted to remain, while the England and Wales voted for Brexit. and even and a lot of the DUP, which are the ultra nutbag unionists in Northern Ireland, have alienated a lot of their base in Britain. Like, the only people who actually cared about them in Britain, the Tories, they've alienated them. And there's actually a constituency now that at least willing to contemplate the idea of unifying with the rest of Ireland. And even a lot of people in the Republic are like not sure how to deal with this, because a lot of them don't want to handle the DUP types in their country. So it's very, very strange.
I agree with you. It's a hard thing to deal with. Thank you so much for your time. Would you like to plug anything as you go?
No, not at the moment. No, I don't have anything to plug.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.